One of the most popular installations, I think, ever at the Tate Modern in London happened in 2003. And it was by Olafur Eliasson. It was called the Weather Project. So it was installed in the big turbine hall at the Tate Modern, which is this massive, massive hall that about every year they commission an artist to do a work inside of. So usually the work is on a very grand scale. And this was a large glowing disc that, of course, modeled the sun. It mimicked the sun, right? And people would come in, they would walk around, but there's also a lower part to the Tate turbine, and people would actually lay out and just sit there and enjoy the sun. And the sun could be modulated. The intensity of the sun could go up and down. So there are a number of ways in which we could talk about this work, but the way we're going to talk about it this week echoes a chapter in Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which I think I've plugged before in this class, namely the chapter called Dimming the Sun. And so the idea of dimming the sun, of not dimming the sun in an art installation, but dimming the actual sun that we're seeing outside our windows, is an idea that's been kicked around over the past a decade or so, and gets us to the core of the idea of geoengineering, and specifically geoengineering in order to combat climate change, global warming, and the increased heat that we're facing on our planet. So this is going to be in some ways the end of our story today. We're going to come back to this idea at the end, because what I'd like to do is sort of trace the idea of geoengineering and manipulating weather over the course of the 20th century. Really, it won't be an exhaustive history. Obviously, we need much more time for that. But it's going to be a selective history of both artworks and also things that are outside of art. So especially geoengineering projects and military projects that have to do with the weather. So it really makes sense for us to start in 1968. And we could have talked about this year 1968 as a very important one, and I've shown you this image before. This is the first time where NASA takes a picture of our planet, of planet Earth, and people can see it in its totality. And this was a utopian moment. There was an idea in the 1960s that, well, now we're seeing the Earth as this totality. We're seeing it from the outside, and we now know that we're all together. We're all in this together. So there was this kind of utopian quality to these images that were coming out of NASA in the late 60s. Of course, there is also a worry, in some ways a worry that's come true, is that once we see the Earth as this object and we see it in its totality, then we start thinking, oh, well, we can claim it as ours, right? We own the Earth. We have this technology where we can take images of it from space that, basically now some have argued that we should think ourselves as gods, as deities, in control of this planet. So I think that's the opposite end of the utopian spectrum of what people were thinking about in the late 60s. In any case, we're in the 60s, and there was a pivotal show that happened in New York at the Dwan Gallery, which was called Earthworks, and this was the arrival of artists that were working directly with the land, with the environment, and with, well, yes, Earth, right? So people like post-minimalists like Robert Morris, Robert Smithson, Dennis Oppenheim, Walter de Maria, Nancy Holt, and so on and so forth. So let me give you a few examples of some of the works that are now called earthworks from this show, or sometimes you'll hear them described as or called land art. The most famous, I would say probably the most famous earthwork or land art is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, which is out in Utah in the Great Salt Lake. So it's this massive spiral-shaped jetty that comes out of the bank of the Great Salt Lake. In this image, you're seeing it not from 1970, but later on, when the Great Salt Lake was had less capacity, there was less water. But you'll also see images of it originally when he made it, where the water would come all the way to the bank. Sometimes the whole thing would get submerged. Sometimes it would be filled with ice. So the weather conditions would change. And this was part of Smithson's project. He was really interested in the notion of entropy and the idea that nature is constantly breaking down, evolving, changing, transforming, and so on and so forth. So it's not static. So not only was he leaving the gallery, leaving the museum, but he's also sort of leaving the idea of making a work of art that needs to be timeless or static. The point of this work for him, as this large earthwork, was that it's part of the environment, and it changes according to the weather and the geological conditions. So it's a fascinating earthwork, lots more to say about it, but long story short, for our purposes today, here's an artist who had to use trucks, large bulldozers, heavy equipment in order to build this. It's very, very large. He's manipulating and moving land. He's moving the landscape around. And so there is this idea of the spiral jetty as a form of geoengineering. And it's so large that actually you can, it's been said that you can see it you can even see it from space. Another example that's quite nice, that's a form of geoengineering, but here in this case, in the sky. This is Whirlpool Eye of the Storm from 1973 by Dennis Oppenheim. He had an airplane, someone fly an airplane. The airplane was directed by radio on the ground. And the airplane pilot was told to trace a tornado in the sky using a jet of smoke, discharged basically by trails of the airplane. And so here is an artwork that's manipulating the sky and trying to model or mimic the vortex of a natural phenomenon, of a hurricane or a tornado in the sky in this case, because it's over land. So it's a very, this is a poetic this is a poetic work. It's a work of art. So he's not really trying to manipulate the weather or the sky in an instrumentalized way. He's doing it in an aesthetic way. But you're going to see later on today that working with and trying to alter the components of the sky, of the stratosphere, of weather, and of clouds is very much a thing within the military and within the space of trying to combat global warming through geoengineering techniques. So it's fascinating to look back at these works and see these artists doing this type of work that in some ways overlaps with the notion of geoengineering. And another very celebrated earthwork is Walter de Maria's the Lightning Field from 1977. And this is in New Mexico. It's really high above, it's pretty high above sea level. It's right near the Continental Divide, and he has these stainless steel poles that are positioned throughout the landscape. It's very large. We're talking about square kilometers here. And the lightning field is then waiting to harness the energy of lightning storms that come through the area. So the work, in some ways, is, well, it's interesting to think, in what way is it simply channeling the lightning and these storms that come through here? And in what way is it actually sort of modeling, is it possible, I don't know enough about optics of
something to research, be interesting, but does this lightning field, this work of art that he's installed, does it actually alter
the lightning and the course of the lightning and the shape, maybe the duration and the intensity. That would be fascinating for two reasons. Because then this work is actually harnessing and manipulating the weather, but also if we're talking about climate change and global warming and natural disasters, which we have all semester long, as being at times produced but certainly exacerbated and intensified by global warming.
We almost see a parallel between this work,
Human-made work, and human-generated warming of the planet as both interacting with, modulating, and intensifying the weather, right? So again, it's really fascinating to go back and to think about these artists, the Robert Smithsons of the world, Dennis Oppenheim, Walter Di Maria, and these early earthwork artists in this new light, in this new, in our more contemporary understanding of the climate, of weather, and of global warming. So one of the ways in which these artists are sometimes criticized is that there's a something of a kind of a macho element to this. There's the idea of, maybe like little boys. We shouldn't gender this anymore, but it used to be thought that little boys are the ones who play with toy trucks and toy bulldozers, and they're the ones that like to move things around. Of course, young girls can do this too, right? There's no reason to limit it. But there is this idea of these male artists sort of playing with their Tonka trucks and moving Earth around and sort of dominating or trying to use the Earth, again, in this sort of geoengineering sort of way. We're gonna, when we get to the session on plant politics, we're gonna talk about feminist or eco-feminist responses to this. So that it doesn't really suit this session, but keep that in mind. Keep this in mind as we move forward there. So we're gonna see a paradigm shift away from this sort of macho earth art, earthwork kind of paradigm to something a bit different. That's more regenerative. That's more eco-feminist, and I'll explain that when we get there. I do want, however, to position a more recent work, which will have a different mood, a different tone than Smithson, Oppenheim, or Di Maria, and this is Francis Alise. He's an artist he's based out of Mexico City. This work was done in Lima, in Peru, and it's called When Faith Moves Mountains from 2002. And so this too is a form of geoengineering, but it's a collective form of geoengineering. He got 500 volunteers, and I watched, you can search for it, it's a short film about this work. It's only 15 minutes long, and it's pretty fascinating because you get to hear directly from those who volunteered. And I think a lot of them were students at the university in Lima, but also people that were living around around Lima and around this large dune, this large sand dune that's in the landscape. So it's fascinating to listen to them talk about what it meant for them to be part of this work. Because here you're seeing the work. They're all 500 people, they're all in a line. Of course, you can't see this, but they're all holding shovels. And the point of the work was for them to move and go over the dune and back down, and the whole time they're digging, and that after this performance is done, the dune will have shifted by a matter of something like 10 centimeters. So they literally moved this dune, moved this mountain. And so it's a collective endeavor. It's a collective form of geoengineering. And again, if you watch this documentary, this short film on it, they talk about how it was difficult because it was incredibly hot and the sun was bearing down, but that they felt I mean, they felt really good. It was a really wonderful collective experience, at least for the people in the film, where they talk about having been involved in this work. And in some ways, this is, as opposed to Smithson or Oppenheimer Di Maria, this is like really much more subtle, and it's almost absurd in a way. Like this is not really overpowering nature. This is just minimally shifting and moving through this collective effort, the landscape, this dune, right? And so there are all sorts of ways in which this is interpreted. Francis Alise himself, he said, this is about maximum effort but minimum result. So there's a bit of an absurdity, but also maybe kind of a melancholic aspect of this, like getting all these people together to do this thing. But at the end of it, although they felt amazing and it's this really beautiful poetic work, there's really nothing that had changed. The change is so minor that it's almost like an absurdist form of geoengineering. They've altered the landscape, but it's barely discernible. So this is I think we can almost see this as a response to these earthworks that are much more about really going in and intervening with the earth, with the landscape. So now, what if I show you this image? At first, you might think that this is another earthwork, that this may be something an artist did in the landscape, or that this is a photograph of an earthwork. And I promise you, I'm not here to trick you, but I'm trying to make a point here, especially coming off the heels of Francis Alise's work that we just looked at. This is not an artwork. This is actually strip mining in West Virginia. So companies that go in and they literally strip the land. It's like you're peeling off, you're stripping off the landscape, the forest, the minerals, and so on and so forth, and then you're leaving it in this sort of desolate condition, more or less scarring the landscape. And so we just looked at a work that was through collective volunteer labor that was minimal. Here we're looking at a work, though it's not really a work, it's industry that is not minimal at all. This really is changing the landscape, and West Virginia is one example of many. I think if you'll think back to the tar sands in Canada, in Alberta, think about the way in which companies that are trying to work on the tar sands and get the shale and the oil out of that. Think how much they've altered the landscape. Could we think of industry as land art then, or as a type of earthwork, taken to the next level on a scale much larger than Smithson or Di Maria or Oppenheimer, the others in the 60s and 70s would have thought of? Maybe there is a way in which we could think of it as an earthwork, which then would lead us to believe that, well, earthworks, maybe the idea of the earthwork has been completely compromised, and that we don't need more working of the earth in this sense, right? Or maybe we could just think of this as an absurd question. Of course, it's not art. Of course, it's not an earthwork. And then it's interesting to think and back up and say why it's not. One possibility is that this is altering the landscape not for aesthetic reasons or philosophical ideas, but simply brute extractivism and resources and profit, right? So interesting thing to think about. And these forms of strip mining, which are definitely a type of geoengineering in a more limited sense, going in and altering the earth for valuable resources. The Austrian artist Matthias Kessler has has worked on this question. And he's done these really wonderful works on wallpaper. He went and photographed these parts of West Virginia that are being strip mined, that are being geoengineered for profit. And he makes wallpaper out of it. These are composite photographs from an airplane, and he makes wallpaper. This one's called Gerald Cemetery. It's a cemetery in West Virginia. He's told me the story of this before. It's quite incredible. Everything's been strip mined in this site in West Virginia, except for the cemetery that's there, because they weren't allowed to strip mine the cemetery because people who live there would go visit their relatives and their ancestors who are buried there. And so there's this real sort of ironic quality to this work, that the only thing that's kept alive in this otherwise stripped down geography is the place for the dead, is the cemetery. And you can see it on the lower right part, the part that still has those like beautiful trees, in the fall colors of trees. That's where the cemetery is, on this hill. And so now people, when they go visit the cemetery, they have to go through this sort of Tolkien landscape of a strip mined countryside. And so he uses this as wallpaper in various installations, and this is the one he did in Germany. And this is wonderful to think through. Like, what does it mean to take these images of strip mining and use them as sort of just backdrop, as wallpaper? That's on the tables, that's on the floor, that's on the walls. He's done lots of different iterations of this, of this wallpaper work of strip mining, and I think it's really interesting to think about. So maybe we'll hear from a number of you who analyze and interpret this work in interesting ways, specifically the strip mining as wallpaper, as just background. Another form of geoengineering, a type of strip mining, which is worrying a lot of people, is deep sea mining, which is not yet a thing. It's not legal, maybe not practicable yet, but it soon might be. And you have activists that are actively resisting this. There's a group called Ocean Rebellion. They're connected with Extinction Rebellion, and another offshoot, Animal Rebellion, activists who are trying to fight for climate justice, against fossil fuels, against animal agriculture, and Ocean Rebellion is against deep sea mining and going in and doing these extractivist processes that we've been doing on land for a long time, and doing it underwater, which would be incredibly destructive for all sorts of reasons. And so I highly recommend watching this work by a collective called Inhabitants, and they worked with Margarita Mendez. This was a work for the New Museum Triennial in 2018 called What is Deep Sea Mining? It's too long for me to show you over this video, but it's still only just a little bit over five minutes. So I would pause the lecture and take a look at that, so you can see both this work, which is kind of it's an artwork, but also a piece of visual journalism. But then you'll also learn a little bit more about what deep sea mining is, how much trouble it'll cause, and the reasons for why some people in industry want to do it, because of course there's value in doing it. So now we turn to a question that's even larger, because in some ways what we've been talking about is small potatoes compared to what's coming next. And in this is the history of changing the weather itself, of ambitions of using and manipulating and changing the weather in itself on a scale that's much larger than the earthworks that we talked about at the beginning today, and much larger than this isolated strip mining that we had just turned to. And so there's a really wonderful German philosopher. His name is Peter Sloterdijk. He's written a number of books that are well worth reading. One is called Foams. And the beginning of Foams, he offers us a history of exactly this: the history of how weather became something that could be manipulated in human history. And he's actually what he says, he's tracing the history of the idea of environmentalism itself. So the idea of the environment is something that has always been with us, but he says at one point in the 20th century it became much more explicit. It became an idea unto itself that we had to consider and think about. And for him, this was born on April 22nd, 1915, where for the first time in history, war. This is part of World War One. This is this is in Ypres in France. This is part of the front between Germany and France during World War One. For the first time in history, biological warfare was implemented. So there was a chlorine gas attack that the Germans used. And so this is very crude, but it was quite deadly. It killed a lot of French soldiers, but I think there was also backwind. They had to wait for a favorable day where the weather was going towards the French front, right? Toward the French troops. But then I think at some point things changed, and the gas doubled back and killed parts of the German army too. It's a completely messy and imprecise instance of biological warfare. And unfortunately, today, biological weapons are much more, I'm sure, much more sophisticated than this. This was just releasing chlorine gas. But for Peter Sloterdijk, this was the first moment where the weather itself was militarized or weaponized, right? Making weather itself a part of warfare explicitly, right? So this is, I would say, within the context of geoengineering, which is our theme for today, this, I think, would have to be considered as one stopping point along the history of geoengineering, especially the type of geoengineering that hopes to manipulate or use the weather. And as you can imagine, even if you know very little about the history of warfare in the 20th century, I think you can probably guess that this idea took on. We don't even, not even to mention nuclear warfare and the way in which nuclear weapons condition the weather. Just think of black rain. After the nuclear attacks in 1945. So if you're interested in this history, I'd suggest going to the Foams and reading that first part that Sloterdijk lays out for a more complete history. We don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I did want us to fast forward to 1996 because this is really fascinating. This takes it to a completely new level, if not multiple new levels. And this was a paper given in 1996 called Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. And it was delivered to the Department of Defense and commissioned by the U.S. Air Force General Staff. And the general theory of this paper was that the country that could own the ionosphere, which is part of the atmosphere, it's one of the higher levels of the atmosphere, will then have quote-unquote battlefield dominance. And what would be entailed by this battlefield dominance? Well, this would include reducing visibility in the airspace strategically against your enemy, or making your enemy troops uncomfortable by manipulating the weather, by being able to modify the intensity of storms. And I think you can understand how being able to work with and manipulating a storm somewhere across the world is one clear way of making an enemy army uncomfortable. Creating artificial droughts. This sounds really nefarious to me. The ability to create aridity, to create artificial droughts, again, strategically, which would really hamper your enemy, and also simply interrupting enemy communications that travel through satellites and that travel through the ionosphere. So a lot of this might sound a bit like science fiction, but in fact there is a research program. This is located in Alaska, well north of Anchorage, called HAARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research program. It was funded by the Air Force, the Navy, the University of Alaska, and DARPA, or Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And so this is this program is theoretically capable through technology in the ionosphere that is beyond me, but it's theoretically capable of doing all sorts of things, including producing climate disasters and earthquakes. And so I think you can probably guess that this secretive program has led to all sorts of conspiracy theories, and so on and so forth. So we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But it is an example of the militarization and the weaponization of the weather, and taken to a really high degree. So if it is possible that a military program, can manipulate the weather and create climate disasters on demand, or an earthquake on demand, I think you can imagine how valuable that would be to a military. I think you don't need that much imagination to see how that would be incredibly destructive, but also effective. And then the other thing is the traceability of these things. Let's say let's say theoretically that at some point it does get used to create terrible weather conditions, or climate disaster, or an earthquake somewhere. In what way could it be traced back? In what way could this natural disaster be verified as not natural at all, but created by a program similar to HARP? I have no idea, and this is highly speculative, and we definitely don't want to traffic in conspiracies in this class. So this is simply a possible example of this history of changing the weather itself and geoengineering the weather, which all leads me to the conclusion of this session, but the major point of this session, because of course in this class we're talking mainly about environmental disasters and climate change and global warming. And so the key question, which we come back to the beginning of today's session where we talked about Olafur Eliasson, is the interest in geoengineering to combat global warming. And I was reading in Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, that already back with Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 60s, there was an idea of working with the weather, not in a military sense, but in a way to create stability. And this is definitely accelerated in the past decade or so. The idea that we can use geoengineering techniques in order to alleviate or deal with global warming. And some of these plans sound a bit crazy. One of the crazier ones is to shoot space mirrors, to put mirrors up into space. I suppose like satellites that would then strategically reflect the sun's rays. By all accounts, to those, the scientists and entrepreneurs that are dealing with geoengineering, this is usually sort of dismissed out of hand. Another really important idea is the idea of carbon capture, of creating machines that will capture and store carbon. I guess this would be really great, but they haven't been able to create them. We don't have this technology. And if you think about it, we would need a lot of these machines, these carbon capture machines. And how would they be built? Well, probably by using a lot of carbon, by using a lot of fossil fuels to create the machines themselves. So how viable of a solution these machines would be, even if we could create them, is something that would probably be open to question. Another idea is to spray seawater into the sky, which would brighten clouds, and then this would theoretically this would then reflect more of the sun's rays. So rather than using mirrors, here we would geoengineer clouds. And there's a wonderful work it's actually a series of works by a Dutch artist. His name's Bernard Smilde. The series is called Nimbus. Nimbus is a type of cloud. This is Nimbus 2 that he did in 2012. And he puts them in spaces, in galleries. He uses mist machines, to create these clouds, these really small clouds in a space, and they evaporate very quickly. They don't last very long at all. It's very ephemeral and fleeting. And so he creates the cloud and then captures it with lighting and staged lighting and photography. So this is really a photographic work of creating this type of cloud. And so this is a work of art, right? But one of these geoengineering ideas would be actually to manipulate and to change the brightness of the clouds that are actually already existing up in the sky. So I think you can see how this work relates to this geoengineering idea. It's just, of course, on a smaller, more poetic scale. But carbon capture, space mirrors, spraying seawater, all that aside, it seems that by far the idea that has gained the most purchase when it comes to geoengineering solutions for global warming is SMR, or solar radiation management. And again, Naomi Klein has a whole chapter in This Changes Everything called Dimming the Sun, which I highly recommend reading because she explains this history and these techniques and the debates. And I think you can probably guess that she falls on the highly skeptical and critical side of these questions. And I suppose I do too, but I think in a class like this, I think we should be a little bit more, maybe a little bit more even-handed, and think about SRM and geoengineering in ways that might be favorable, or at least try to think of ways it might be favorable, and be a bit more even-handed before then we land, as I do, on the more critical side of things, that it's not something that we should be doing. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So what is solar radiation management? Well, Naomi Klein, from the chapter I just referenced, gives it to us very clearly. This is the strategy of spraying sulfate aerosols, using aerosols of sulfate into the stratosphere, which then would reflect the sun's rays. Whether via specially retrofitted airplanes or a very long hose suspended on helium balloons, and she says that some scientists have even suggested using cannons. And so one of the events that led to this idea of SMR is an eruption that happened in the Philippines at Mount Pinatubo in 1991. And not all eruptions do this, but some eruptions are so powerful that they shoot up sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, which is how we know that sulfate aerosols cool the climate. Because for a couple years, maybe even more, for a few years after this eruption, we now know, we can see that global temperatures went down. And so effectively this eruption was a temporary solution to global warming. At least that's the theory of those who champion solar radiation management. And indeed, Naomi Klein talks about scientists who have researched, who have taken a look back at other eruptions that are not part of the historical record, as this one would be, of course, because it's 1991. But they've been able to cobble together and make compelling claims that there have been other eruptions like this that are so powerful that sent sulfate into the atmosphere, and that the world cooled as a result. So this is one of the big reasons why scientists and geoengineers think, well, this could work. This could be a solution to global warming. So here is an example. This is by a company that's called their idea, and I have no idea if they've actually built anything, but it's called the Strato Shield, and this would be an example of solar radiation management, of SRM. So you see this big balloon that's releasing sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, effectively deflecting the sun's rays. And in this diagram, as I was doing research for this session, it was funny to look at all the diagrams that come with these plans for SRM, for this type of geoengineering the atmosphere, because they're all in many ways kind of cutesy and cartoony, which is I think very different from the reality of what this would be like, because almost every scientist thinks that this is like a last ditch resort. But in any case, they also include a volcano in the background. And at first you might think, well, why is there this volcano in the background? Well, it's because one of the reasons we know why sulfates might work is because of these volcanic eruptions like Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. So I do want to mention something that Naomi Klein talks about, which I found really interesting, is that with most scientific experiments, they can be tested, right? They can be tested on smaller scales. So it's increasingly controversial, but a lot of testing happens on non-human animals in order to figure out whether or not we can then start testing on humans, on us, right? So this is really the way the scientific method happens. But when we're on this scale, when we're talking about manipulating the atmosphere with sulfates, the test and the thing itself are the same, right? We don't have another planet Earth somewhere where we could test it out and see, oh, how's it going to go? What's going to happen? How do we know for sure that this is going to work? We can't do that, right? With this level, with this scale. So that's a really interesting thing to think about. So this is a technocratic fix that would be, we'd have to be all in. And that doesn't even get to the political part of the equation, which is all these states, these countries around the world would have to join up to agree to do this, right? Because if anything is global warming is global, right? So very interesting thing to think about. And as I was preparing this lecture, I couldn't help but continually come back to Don't Look Up, which if anyone hasn't seen it yet, I recommend watching it because it'll sort of enrich our class this semester, because it has to do, it very much has to do with a lot of the ideas that we deal with. And so specifically here, if you have seen it, I hope I don't spoil anything for anyone who hasn't seen it, but this is the billionaire, I forget his name now, but the one who's sort of taken on the task to save humanity and create these machines that'll go up and break up the comet, the asteroid that's coming towards the Earth. Of course, the metaphor is that the comet is global warming, right? And there's another wonderful coincidence or detail here, because if you remember from the film, the machines that he builds to go up there and to break up the comet, well, not only are they breaking up the comet, but they're also interested in mining all the valuable resources, the mineral resources that are on the comet, right? So linking up with our discussion before about strip mining, both on Earth but in the ocean, this is now taking strip mining up into space, right? So the question of whether or not we should allow we should think of billionaires like Elon Musk and so on and so forth as climate saviors through technological fixes and through geoengineering is definitely something that we want to talk about and think through. And so what are the pros and cons of SMR? Like, how can we be more informed, even though we can't test it because it's just too large of a scale? The test would be the thing itself. Naomi Klein does give us some useful ways of thinking about solar radiation management, and she gives some pros and cons, and she gives more cons than pros, probably because there are more cons than pros. So she says, unlike carbon capture, which we talked about a moment ago, it doesn't exist yet. This technology does exist, and it would be relatively cheap to do. And the cooling effect would kick in right away. Right? Global temperatures would go down in the same way that they did, theoretically the same way they did with Mount Pinatubo in the years after 1991. So those are the pros. That's the argument for using SMR to deal with global warming. The cons, on the other hand, are more numerous. There would be permanent haze, and possibly the blue skies would no longer be a thing. There would no longer be a blue skies. It would probably prevent some astronomical research. So those that look up into the stars and the celestial bodies and study these things, they would have a much harder time doing so because the visibility would go down. It would impede. It would likely impede solar power generators. So this is kind of perverse then, because one of the big solutions, one of the big technological solutions that we could be championing is solar power to mitigate global warming. So if that gets impeded by this, then it feels like it's self-defeating in some ways, right? We wouldn't be able to stop. Like, this would have to be something that continually happens, because if it stopped, the idea is, most scientists say that the heat would just rush back in, and maybe in catastrophically, right? So it's something we would have to continue doing. It would be like just, a permanent new thing, a permanent new world. Maybe one of the most damning cons is that it does nothing to change the underlying cause. So this is the proverbial band-aid, right? If all you do is put a bandage on the wound, but the reasons you keep getting that wound you don't deal with, well, that's effectively what we have here, right? This does nothing to change the underlying cause of global warming, which is the global emissions of greenhouse gases, right? So it feels more like a patch or a band-aid than getting straight to the source, right? But probably the most damning con, and the one that Naomi Klein puts forth most forcefully as the reason why there's no way we should be even thinking about SMR, is that while it would help with global warming, while it would lower temperatures a bit, which would largely help the northern hemisphere and developed countries, it would have catastrophic effects on equatorial Africa and in South Asia, because, and we know this because of Mount Pinatubo, we know this because of these eruptions of sulfate aerosols into the sky. It creates droughts. It creates, it impedes precipitation in those parts of the world, in the global south. So it would create horrible droughts and famine and death on a massive scale in South Asia and in parts of Africa. And so that con alone should be a reason to never try this, and to try other things, including actually having the political will to reduce emissions, and degrowing the economies, the two major economies that are responsible for greenhouse gases, which is fossil fuels and animal agriculture. So this gets us to our final point, and a topic that we're going to be talking about much more when we get together in class, in relation to Demos's chapter on geoengineering and social justice. I think you can tell that the equation I've just laid out for you, it's a worrying one, but if solar radiation management was a go, it would be with the knowledge that we are sacrificing certain parts of the world, certain parts of the world that are more poor, certain parts of the world that are that are racially different, right? That are from different ethnicities and different cultures. Because Klein makes the excellent point that if solar radiation management, if the fallout of it was that there would be turmoil and drought and horrible natural events in Europe and in the United States, there would be no one would be talking about using it, right? But the idea that it would affect African nations and South Asian nations, it's disturbing then that scientists maybe would be willing to sacrifice those parts of the world. And so you got to think that there may very well be probably not a directly racist impulse in these scientists' minds. That's really unlikely. But it is possible that geoengineering on this scale and solar radiation management, hard baked into it in a structural sense, would be effectively a form of environmental racism, right? And the idea that certain parts of the world are a cost for the benefit of cooling the planet through sulfate aerosols. So complex political question here, but I think it's compelling to think of this and to sort of work through the ways in which, however beneficial as a last resort solar radiation management would be, effectively it would cause disproportionate environmental disasters on non-white and non-European peoples and on poorer nations on the globe. So if we're talking about political ecology in this class, which we are continually doing, this is something that we certainly will have to discuss and think through.